Next Curve.
Welcome, everyone. This is the Next Curve Rethink podcast. And in this episode, we break down, once again, the latest tech and industry events and happenings into the insights that matter. And I'm Leonard Lee, Executive Analyst at Next Curve. In this particular episode, we're going to be talking about this really elusive thing called enterprise-grade generative AI. And, we're going to bring to you tales from the front lines where practitioners are accumulating scar tissue, making generative AI and agentic AI work for businesses. And so this should be a really exciting topic for many of you listeners out there and viewers. And I am joined by two very special guests. Cal
Al-Dhubaib.
He is the head of AI and data science at Further. And we have Joseph Enochs, who is Chief AI Officer at Enterprise Vision Technologies. And gentlemen, thank you both for coming on. I really appreciate it. And in fact, I'm quite honored, to tell you the truth.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for having us, Leonard.
Absolutely. And before we get started, please remember to like, share, react, and comment on this episode. Also subscribe here on YouTube and on Buzzsprout to listen to us on your favorite podcast platform. Opinions and statements by my guests are their own and don't reflect mine or those of Next Curve. And so, gentlemen, it's great again to have you here. It was also wonderful to meet you both in Deer Valley. And we were there attending KeyBank's Capital Market Technology Leadership Forum. That was my first time. I don't know if it was yours. It wasn't yours, right, Joe? You've been there before, right?
No.
You're a veteran, I know, because everyone loves you there.
It's our first time in Deer Valley, but we've been to, they had it in prior years in Vail.
Yeah. And you know what? The reason why I wanted you guys on really bad, quite honestly, is that as I mentioned before we press the record button here, is you guys are in a rare category of folks that I think who really get it, right? And it's simply because you guys are in the trenches, are working with clients to make generative AI work for them, as well as Agentic, right? Because, and we can talk about Agentic as well. But you guys were up on stage on a panel hosted by Trevor Upton. Great job, Trevor, by the way, props to you. And you guys were joined by Leo Mayerovich, I think that's his name, and then Lee Pan, right?
Lee Pan, yeah.
Who are also wonderful panelists, but you guys just blew me away. I've been looking at generative AI for quite some time, simply because everybody in the semiconductor industry were talking about it far before, long before ChatGPT came onto the scene. And, when it did break and people were talking about how it's going to be transformative for the enterprise, I had to take a double take at those claims and basically warn people, wait a minute, right? This is quite the experimental technology at the moment. And that, we need to be thoughtful in terms of how we apply the technology. And I saw a lot of the thoughtfulness that's requisite to getting to enterprise industrial grade applications through the insights that you guys shared. And so what I really want to try to do is capture some of that lightning in a bottle that came out of that discussion, because it was fantastic and you guys rock. So anyway.
Hopefully we don't disappoint, Leonard, but looking forward to the conversation.
I told you to make Act 2 just as good.
You guys are like freaking pros. Don't even act like you don't even know that. Okay, please. You guys are awesome. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to talk about three things here. Actually, simple questions that I think a lot of the audience is asking themselves, especially if they're trying to delve into generative AI and agentic. Is number one, why has enterprise generative AI and agentic been so difficult to realize, right? There's a lot of talk about it. We hear about POCs that struggle. I'm sure you guys have experienced a lot of those as well. But, what really are the sticking points that get in the way of actually getting these things out into production and scale? Even, that sounds so cliche, but you know what I'm talking about, right? The other thing is, what are the keys to safe and enterprise grade generative AI and Agentic today, right? Because this ball is constantly moving, but there's things that I think enterprises need to tune into as they, try to frame their thinking around what a safe and enterprise grade is. And then finally, what are your recommendations, for getting for organizations to get started, or maybe even course correcting their generative AI and agentic initiatives as they look forward, right? Because we're still in pretty early days in experimentation. At least that's my sense. So who wants to start with that first one? Knowing
I'm happy to kick it off. This is top of mind for me, actually. I'm in the process of putting together a keynote where I'm really diving into exactly why it is we're seeing such a long time for enterprise Gen AI in particular to get adopted. And it's funny. It's not that different from machine learning making, it's premier in the enterprise. So I found this great report from Informatica published earlier this year. And they, in that report, there's some pretty sobering numbers. You might have heard the MIT study where it's like 95% of AI projects fail. I think there's a lot of issues with that particular study. Sample size, highly defined success. But in this one, where they're really surveying thousands of executives, 97% of these leaders have actually faced difficulties demonstrating the business value of Gen AI. And about 2/3 of enterprises really get stuck in particular on transitioning from the pilot to production. And it's some of the usual suspects. The leading cause, no surprise, is that a lot of industry stakeholders, they have misunderstandings or misconceptions of what are the right problems to be solved with AI.
Right.
And so it starts from there. And then you have issues with, actually, if you're going to apply generative AI on top of any enterprise content data, well, it turns out that content data has to be mastered and governed, and there's a whole set of issues with permissions and privacy. And so the flywheel just starts from there. And once you get to that initial pilot where it's like, cool, we've built something that's interesting. And then you realize there's all these systemic issues that need to be tackled. It's not surprising then that it takes a lot of time for these pilots to go to production, or you go back to the drawing board saying, maybe we picked the wrong problem to start with.
Yeah. You know what's really interesting, if you don't mind, Joseph, is everything you just outlined is completely opposite of the notion of what people think in terms of how do you arrive at a world model, which I think is a common understanding or conception of what it means to build a generative AI, right? They project that onto the enterprise. But anyways, I thought that's just something that really clicked for me as you were going through your description there. But Joseph, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, resonating with Cal, I think you guys saw in Q1 that there was a CIO playbook study that came out. And there were 4 main primitives that they talked about were the challenges. The first one being sort of education, like what is this new invention? I think, people when they were talking about AI before had really seen narrow AI where it was, Google Maps or, something giving me a playlist. And that was well understood. And then when the Chat GPT moment, I think that was most people's really first date, if you will, with AI. But when that study was published, in Q1, it said education, and I like to key on that because when I say AI, I think a lot of practitioners seem to like, if I don't understand what it is, I'm just going to call it AI, right? I'm just going to fill that in. And a lot of definitions, the definition varies dependent on who you talk to. A lot of people believe that AI is this rocket ship that does backflips and lands on this platform out on the ocean and drives itself home. And when the reality of it is it's really more like a fast car. It can get you there faster. But if we don't have really an education and understanding of what the limitations of this new invention are, then sort of the sky's the limit. And I think that's where the initial that study shows, and I think there's a lot of credence to that, because if we're not really have a good, clear understanding of the capabilities of the technology, and then we're trying to choose high ROI use cases, we're not really grounded and level set on what the parameters of and capabilities of this are. So we're choosing use cases based on limited understanding. So once we get to that point, to exactly what Cal's saying, did we choose the right use case? Well, maybe we thought it could do more than it could. So now we're in the prototyping phase, and we thought this thing could do backflips, and the reality of it is it can't. And so moving from prototype into MVP, we really have to have that ROI. So for me, I think the first step is that education. And with that education, there's some primitives associated with that. And it can't be just like in the book reading. For us, we try to enable like OJT. We want training on it in a safe environment that's been somewhat approved for your use case or your enterprise. Then it's more of how can I apply this to my subject matter expertise, right? And I think in that scenario, you're creating a much safer space for people to be able to identify what ROI means for them, then bring it into MVP. Then again, to Cal's point, figure out the ins and outs of actual data, actual use cases. And that at that point, that's only when we can determine full TCO. In my opinion, is that you can't determine TCO until you really get it on some live data. And then once you understand TCO, now we can talk about how do we industrialize this particular invention or application.
Yeah. And speaking of limitations, because I think that's really important, it's something that I advise my clients on all the time. It's, and you're making some fantastic points there, Joseph, is what do you mean by AI? You unpack that, you break that down, and then you start to you work with the client to understand what their expectations are. What are the conceptions they have of their, in particular definition of AI? Then you start to work through what are the possibilities, but just as importantly, the limitations. So what are I think in terms of possibilities, everybody has a pretty wild imagination, so you can imagine a lot of stuff. What I think is really more grounded in technology and knowledge of technology itself are the limitations. And so what do you see as being some of those gating challenges, those hurdles that are common across the different scenarios that you're working with your clients on? And maybe Cal, if you can start and share your perspective there.
So I'll talk about what's working and where we're seeing a lot of adoption. AI-based coding assistance is hands down one of the fastest growing categories of use.
Yeah.
A near extension of that. So you probably have heard the term vibe coding.
Yeah.
We're now seeing the adoption of the term vibe analytics or vibe analysis. And so equipping data analysts with the ability or analysts with the ability to talk to data sets and enterprise documents to be able to ask questions. I've seen examples of this in the legal space, for example, being able to ask questions about specific contracts or terms. I've seen examples in just trying to interpret user adoption of digital products, for example, and providing a layer for those business analysts to be able to ask questions. We're also seeing a lot of interest and maturity in creative content. So at Further, we work pretty closely with Adobe, and Adobe's Firefly Studio makes it really easy to take a creative asset and then retexture something.
Yeah.
Or take we're talking to a few retailers now about taking their 1,000+ inventory of catalogs and being able to animate and rotate and create dimension to what was a static image. And so those are some use cases that are relatively safe to fail in because there's still a lot of human oversight involved in going from that asset to what ultimately gets published. And in the case of coding, you still have somebody who is interpreting the result or critiquing the code. As far as limitations go, where we start to see organizations struggle, it's when they haven't yet gotten to maturity with using the out-the-box tools. They haven't yet mastered Copilot and GitHub Copilot and the basics, and now they're like, all right, we're now going to build our own LLM that can be used to solve this particular document process automation. And then they realize very quickly, oh, they don't have the right data for that, or they have to be really careful in how they set up guardrails. And then very quickly they realize, oh, this is going to be a much bigger investment than we initially thought. And so it's not that these projects aren't possible. It's that it's surprising the amount of investment it takes to get them to become performant. And then you get into this question of, well, is it worth the squeeze?
That's often the case, right? A lot of organizations might think that this is kind of a fire and forget type of thing, but it really isn't. And there's an entire life cycle, actually. There's deployment, but then there's a whole maintenance that a lot of folks still don't talk about much. Because to your point, this motion toward production has been a lot slower than a lot of folks have anticipated. And we have to keep in mind, we're 3 years into, this post-chat GPT era. So this is a lot of time when you consider the speed of innovation around generative AI, but organizations have that whole full life cycle to look forward to. But Joseph, maybe you can share your perspective.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple paradigms. I think we talk about like the zero to hero kind of model, and when you're like AI product management, you want to look at a project or product, and you want to use the minimum amount of AI that you need to do something. Not every problem needs a large language model, right? Not every problem needs a small language model. Not every problem actually needs AI, right? If you've got a traditional workflow that's working well, that's probably not the best place to start with AI. But if your existing workflow, like you're talking about, your coding workflow is cumbersome, it's time consuming. The research to understand some libraries would take a person without a coding assistant or a research assistant thousands of hours that can be condensed down into a short period of time. I mean, these are areas where we can make benefits with AI. I think to your point in that grounding, exactly what Cal talked about, if you have people you train on this coding assistant, but you got to train them on the basics of prompt engineering first. If they go through like the RTF framework or the create framework and have them do some prompt engineering. And in our workshops, we usually do like a 6 to 8 week sort of transition where we have them go through the basics of prompt engineering, and then we move them right to the IDE, and whether that's Cursor or GitHub Copilot, and get them situational awareness of exactly where the copilots exist, exactly where inline versus the chat versus, all those components, agentic mode, get them really understanding with that. And then we build an app together, right? We'll grab some data, show them how to illustrate that data, how to, build JSON structure, how to put some middleware on that, how to put a front end on it, and how to do that all within the context of the RTF or create framework. So we build upon those things, but then we give them sort of license and agency to go out and build these things. And I think that really grounding sort of helps them establish the limitations on what these things are, what they can do with data. I mean, Cal, you hit a great point about data. If I give an LLM, 20 tables and expect it to traverse through all those things, it's going to struggle with that, right? We need to figure out, give it some sort of semantic layer in between that to make it easy for the AI to interact with that. That's a limitation that I don't think people naturally see, right? I think that's one limitation, but I think there's many others that I don't think people really grasp, like tool calling. Folks, maybe just a brief point on that, right? When we want to have an LLM, when we talk just to an LLM, you guys remember back in the day, it would say, "Oh, my training hasn't been 2023. I can't tell you anything about it." Now, if you ask ChatGPT something, it has tools in the background that it can go pull these things, but it has limitations, right? It can maybe do 25, 26 tools. You give it the 27th or 28th tool, and it's going to get confused. And then if you look at the smaller models, when we're trying to do smaller models offline, maybe it can handle 8 or 9 tools, and that the 10th tool, right, it gets confused. So those are some limitations. I know there's things like MCPs and things of that nature that we can do to help them, but I think just it's that stick time, right, and that grounding first that really helps people to really, to your point, understand those limitations.
Well, and frankly, LLMs don't have a really good sense of chronology either. And so I often, even in my own prompting, not even using it for programmatic reasons or just looking up information, I have to say, use information or sources only from 2025 or only from 2024 and beyond. And if you don't do that, we saw an example where a client was interested in setting up their own custom GPT on top of their HR policies. Well, unless they have somebody navigate it to what is the most up-to-date version of the PTO policy and where to find it, it's going to give conflicting information from whichever policy ends up being the most convenient to answer the solution. And so there's a lot of these little gotchas that enterprises realize, oh, wait, we have to actually master this stuff to be ready for AI.
Oh, wow. You guys are wow, that's some deep stuff. That's a lot of complexity. I mean, as I'm listening to you, both of you talk, it almost seems like you need, to make the application generative AI enterprise grade, you really do need to look at specific applications and then maybe even assess how that generative AI needs to be applied in order to support all the requirements of that particular application. And that could differ from application to application to application. So it's not we're not looking at a generic set of scenarios that are supported by a homogeneous or a horizontal architecture. You really need to start working some of these stovepipes and working through the complexities and nuances of making these things purpose oriented for a particular process, function, or what have you. I mean, that's the feeling, man.
And where and when to apply generative AI and when not to, right? When we look at, like, as an example, there's this universal disconnect, I think, in enterprise a lot of times from the business and the business applications to the technology stack. Yeah. And even in the technology stack, you have server, compute, cloud, you have all of these teams, right, that are independent because they're dealing with things at massive scale. But then you have the business applications that are driving the business. There's a lot of telemetry stack that exists on the infrastructure, but there's a gap oftentimes between those business applications and the infrastructure stack. And like, trying to rebuild all of the telemetry with the generative AI, probably not a good thing, but maybe something on a core application where you can take indications from that core application and elevated alerts from your infrastructure platform, correlate those things, which would probably be very challenging for you to write some script to be able to do that. But the LLMs can really take those things in, and with the right context and the right prompting and maybe some fine tuning, not necessarily, can correlate these things and find signal. In that scenario, our token counts are down, right? Because we're not giving it everything. We're only giving it a limited subset. It's really targeted at a particular high value business application. And in that scenario, maybe it does make sense for us to have an LLM, right? Whereas if we're just expecting it to do something general purpose, the tokenomics may not work out for us to do that.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, because one of the things that I'm starting to raise is the importance of, you guys are familiar with FinOps, right? But having that for a generative AI, because the economics and the nuances of what you might consider FinOps for generative AI is very different. It's like, on the surface, it looks like it's the same. It's not, right? Just because the underlying mechanisms, financial mechanisms, if you will, tend to be different. I wanted to shift the conversation to the keys to safe and enterprise-grade generative AI. If, in very simple terms, if you can maybe share with our audience, what are those keys? And there is a particular word that I haven't heard yet, but I'm hoping I'm going to hear it from one of you guys.
Oh no!
You go first, okay, and then Cal, you do cleanup.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, so I think from my perspective, like we try to create, we start actually with compliance with the enterprise, let's say enterprise, right? And we try to look at the controls that apply to our enterprise customers. Yeah. And if we look at like two main frameworks. We have the NIST RMF or ISO 42001, depending on what organization you align to. But we usually use that as our baseline. And that gives us, it's actually ISO 42001 has a really good, well-written standard with a lot of controls in it. So we kind of start with that, those sort of elements. And it does include logging and cataloging and red teaming and some very significant components, guardrails and things of that nature. So we kind of start with that, like we call it the compliance first sort of AI foundations, if you will.
No,
and we build that compliance first AI mindset so that we can then step back to that education that we talked about and have a compliant sandbox that looks like what production would look like. But now when we're training people and we're onboarding them for that particular training, now they're training in a sandbox that eventually could be promoted from our development sandbox area into our, what we call the hourglass. I have to give some credit to some of my other colleagues who came up with that, but the hourglass and shaping it onto basically a platform that is, again, this compliance first AI platform. And so I think that's kind of how we look at it, is we look at the end first and all of those controls. We step that back for the platform. And as we're educating and onboarding those things, we want that sort of fast track so that eventually you have intelligent infrastructure. So if I'm building an agent, I want to drop that agent into an environment. It's got all the guardrails. It's got all the memory management, tool management, semantic layers, all those things that I don't want to have to build every time I build an agent or buy an agent. I want to put those primitives in place, right? And so for us, I think that's just the basis of the foundation for a safe and secure type of agentic AI framework for an enterprise.
Man, it's gonna be tough to follow that, right, Cal?
I mean, there's very little to add on the compliance side, but I'll raise a couple of things. One is that there's very fascinating world of ethics when it comes to agentic AI that we're starting to confront now. So Adobe and Google recently were a part of a new standard release called APK2 or something like that. And it's basically a payments protocol for agentic solutions. And so let's say you have an agent, which is nothing more than a LLM powered piece of software that has the ability to act autonomously. And you want to use it to book a flight. Hey, agent, I'm trying to go to New York. I want to keep it under $400 round trip. I need to travel by Tuesday morning and be back by Thursday evening, the week of the 28th. Great. So now there's this fascinating ethics of this agent has to be able to access your payment method. It has to have your consent. It has to act on that and be able to act with fiduciary responsibility now, and in fact, purchase within the constraints that you set and report back. And I think that this is, as enterprises start building more and more agentic solutions, this space of what is considered consent, how can it be managed, how is it withdrawn, how do you securely share payment information? This is the next wave of challenges that enterprises are going to need to address. And it's non-trivial. And so I don't think that this is going to be a 6 to 12 month road to agents everywhere. I think we're going to see another 3 to 5 year development cycle, very much like what it took to go from the ChatGPT moment to where we are today.
Yeah, no, those are great points, because things like trust framework for agentic transactions, a lot of people are talking about agent to agent and MCP and all this stuff, but the security layer is clearly not there. I was at RSA 2025, and that was one of the biggest concerns. And even more recently at Cisco Live, where that topic came up, and we're still a very long way. And it literally is in and of itself an infrastructure build out, right? And for an enterprise, it's likely going to be a similar kind of build out, because right now the conversation is more about like a public registry or a set of registries, or setting up MCP servers to serve as like kind of like a web server or what have you. But it's not that easy. And we have to remember, the internet in its early days was not exactly the most secure thing in the world, right? And there was a lot of innovation that had to go in, and engineering that had to go into making it a bit more secure. And I think it's tough to these days to argue that mission is accomplished. It seems to have its challenges on a day-by-day basis, right? So, but no, that's great sharing. So, for those organizations that are looking to kickstart their generative AI or agentic AI initiatives, or those that are trying to course correct because they're bumping into these walls that you guys have described, what are some of your salient recommendations to these folks in terms of first steps or pivots?
I think the biggest trap I've seen is the efficiency trap. And it's this, we're enamored with, we can save, 10x the time on doing X.
Okay.
And then a lot of enterprises are surprised when, oh, wait, the cost of compute relative to what we're getting, or the token usage for a use case just doesn't make sense. And you still need humans in the loop. And so I'd say, just from a fundamentals perspective, prioritize the use cases that lead to growth. And so a lot of our clients that are experiencing success with homegrown generative AI experiences are doing it to do things like helping customers navigate their cart and select products and shorten the time to making a purchase, for example, or being able to navigate an enterprise's resources more effectively, to be able to drive decision-making faster. So I would say that from where we've seen a lot of success, there's this fallacy of efficiency is the best use of Gen AI, when I think growth is really the better use.
Oh, really? Okay. Wow. All right. What about you, Joseph?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, it really depends on what your standards are in the organization. And I always want to start with that. So if you already are on Copilot, right, or you're already on Databricks, or you're already on AWS Bedrock, right, if those are your standards, let's work within those standards that you have and try to sort of establish those as the baseline. Then from that, I want to have some real education with your people, right? Get some group together, a group of your architects, right? Some groups, some cross-functional groups, and get those folks together and get them enabled on this sort of platform that you have. And the regulations are changing. You won't know everything day one, but let's start with what your policies are and what your standards are, and let's get some OJT. Then what I really want to do is I want to get those cross-functional people together now that they've been empowered with these tools, and I want them to come up with these ideas. Now, we can put some guardrails in place on how we define ROI. We mostly want to align with our clients on what their definition of ROI and their definition of value is. But let's set that primitive up and get these cross-functional teams together, because what we've seen is two parts of the business right now, a lot of times they're not talking to each other. They're in silos, right? But if you get these cross-functional teams together, the studies have shown it's significant, like 80% improvement on ideation. And right now, this invention that we have with AI can make this ideation to reality much smaller. Now, it's not you wave a magic wand and it's there, but getting these cross-functional teams that have now been enabled on this safe platform, those is where, for me, you're going to start getting the signal. I mean, we just did one of these. It's a 8-week type of engagement with an organization. And one part of the business was offering a solution, and another part of the business was actually doing the billing of this system. And those two, they knew that there was some benefit that could be garnered. But every time they tried to come together to get a prototype, they would reach out to their partners, and it was a significant cost, like, hundreds of thousands of dollars for them to figure out, whether there was going to be high ROI there. And that would always get deprioritized. But by putting these teams together and empowering them to be able to prototype, they were able to find tens of millions of dollars in cost savings. just by those parts of the value stream that had never been allowed to talk together. Now they can talk together. Now they're empowered. Now they have a safe space to do these things. I would say start with that. See what's going to happen out of that. And now we could move into like what we talked about, your compliance. Are you going to do NIST RMF, that sort of thing? Let's find those guardrails. Let's fill the gaps in those things. That's going to allow us to bring those into MVP. But let's start with getting people excited and getting people trained and bringing these cross-functional teams together. They know where the gold is in the organization. We've just got to give them the license to come together.
Man, you guys are too good. This is like, quite honestly, quite ridiculous. But hey, I wanted to circle back really quickly to the comment you made earlier, Cal, about growth. And I think it's an important one. You're right. This fixation on efficiency, and oftentimes that leads to this notion that you can get rid of people. But growth means also force multiplication.
Yep.
So the folks that you have, if you're going to grow your business, you want to force multiply your resources, including your people. And that really resonated with me, Cal. So I think it is important. It's important to have that mindset as well, because when we look at how AI is being applied in the semiconductor industry, it's not that you need less engineers. You need to force multiplier engineers. Otherwise, Moore's law is dead, right?
Exactly.
These chip designs are becoming so complex, advanced packaging, all these things are just creating additional factors of complexity that, a human engineer is going to have trouble dealing with. The AI, generative AI has a role in force multiplying things so that, technology can continue to advance, right? So, wow, you guys just really blow me away. We could probably go on for like ever, right? Don't you think?
We have to do this again for sure then.
We'll have to do it again. And then once again, I deeply appreciate the ground truths that you both surface in the work that you do. And I'll reiterate, just supremely impressed by both of your participation on that panel in Deer Valley. And I definitely look forward to continuing our conversation, but also hanging out with you guys once again and just having a great exchange of ideas, experiences, and perspectives. So both of you, thank you so much.
Thank you, Leonard. This is a pleasure. I love hanging out with both of you.
Yeah, you guys,
fantastic.
Love you guys. And I'm really excited to share both of you guys to the Next Curve audience. And so why don't you share with our audience how they can get in touch with you? And, maybe, Cal, why don't you start off?
I pretty much live and breathe on LinkedIn. So if any of this sounds interesting or exciting to you, hit me up there. But yeah, I'd love to hear any questions that this conversation sparked.
Yeah, please hit me up on LinkedIn as well. I just recently co-authored a document with IT Revolution Press called The Revenge of QA. So please check that out, give it a like. And later this year, I will have a book with O'Reilly coming out. It's going to be in pre-release here, probably before the end of the year for vision models and multimodal learning. So please, when that book comes out, check it out.
Yeah, everyone, these guys are a real deal. I'm serious. After 3 years of this hype, you guys are a breath of fresh air, and you bring a lot of realness. And I highly recommend everyone, get in touch with these two gentlemen and their organizations. It's very apparent that they're doing some very instrumental work in advancing enterprise AI. So. Enterprise generative AI and AI as well. And I'm on LinkedIn a lot too, but I want to warn you guys, I come off as a grouchy AI. Okay. I'm a pragmatist. Okay. And that is the only reason why you guys are on this show, because you guys bring that practical angle to a rather hype technology at the moment. And so again, thank you.
Very aligned.
Thank you. Thank you so much, guys.
Yeah. Okay. Before we leave, please just subscribe to our podcast. It'll be featured on the Next Curve YouTube channel. Check out the audio version on Buzzsprout or find us on your favorite podcast platform. Also, subscribe to Next Curve Research Portal at www.next-curve.com. Let me get that straight. Oh my gosh. I don't even know the URL of my own company, www.next-curve.com for the tech and industry insights that matter. And I'm so sorry, Cal. I'll get it right next time. Okay, buddy. All right. Take care.